They saw the frayed tweed of his jacket and labeled him a vagrant. They saw his pained silence and judged him feeble-minded. But when the most ruthless corporate raider on Wall Street tried to have the old man thrown out onto the cold Chicago pavement, he had no idea he was sneering at the architect of the very skyline he so arrogantly claimed to command. Everyone in the gilded dining room saw a pathetic old man, a piece of human refuse that had drifted into their pristine world. They laughed at him, they pitied him, they wanted him gone, but they didn't see what the waitress saw. And when she stepped from the shadows and wrote 4 simple words on a napkin, she didn't just silence a room. She resurrected a legend and brought a titan of industry to his knees. What happens when the person you dismiss as worthless holds the forgotten blueprint to your entire existence? You are about to find out. The Pinnacle wasn't merely a restaurant, it was the summit of Chicago's social Olympus, perched on the 95th floor of the iconic Sterling Tower. Its floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of Lake Michigan and the sprawling city lights below. The air was thick with the scent of seared Wagyu, vintage Bordeaux, and the cloying perfume of generational wealth. For Clara Mayhew, it was just a job, a grueling, soul-crushing job that paid for her grandmother's oxygen tanks and the mountain of medical bills that threatened to bury them both. Clara, 22 and carrying the weight of a woman twice her age, retied her starched white apron, her fingers nimble, but her spirit frayed. 4 years ago, she'd been the University of Chicago's most promising history major, a prodigy in the field of medieval paleography, the study of ancient and historical handwriting. She could distinguish a 12th century Carolingian minuscule from its 13th century Gothic successor from 50 paces. Her grandmother, a retired librarian who had raised her, had nurtured this passion, teaching her the art of calligraphy on rainy Sunday afternoons. "A person's hand, Clara Bell," she would say, her voice smelling of old paper and Earl Grey tea, "is the truest map of their soul." But academic accolades couldn't pay for the ravages of pulmonary fibrosis. The scholarship money had been a kapok seed in a hurricane of hospital copays and prescription costs. Now, the girl who once deciphered medieval charters was clearing plates for men who treated her as if she were invisible. "Mayhew, Table 7 wants their check, and they look impatient. Smile like you mean it," barked Mr. Davies, the restaurant's manager. Davies was a man perpetually on the verge of a panic attack, his thinning hair plastered to his sweaty scalp. He lived in mortal terror of his high-powered clientele, especially the man currently holding court in the restaurant's prime corner booth. Julian Croft. At 40, Croft was the CEO of Croft Holdings, a piranha in a bespoke sharkskin suit. He was handsome in the way a panther is handsome, all sleek muscle and predatory intent. He specialized in hostile takeovers, buying beloved Chicago institutions, gutting them for parts, and selling off the real estate. He was celebrating his latest kill, the acquisition of a century-old local newspaper with a coterie of fawning junior executives who laughed a fraction of a second too early at all his jokes. "So, the old union boss looks me in the eye," Croft boomed, his voice slicing through the hushed elegance of the room, "and he says, 'You can't do this. This paper is the soul of Chicago.' And I told him," Croft paused for dramatic effect, "the soul is an asset, and right now it's undervalued. We're liquidating it Monday." The table erupted in sycophantic laughter. Clara approached to refill their water glasses, her movements practiced and silent. Croft didn't even glance at her. He gestured dismissively toward a spilled drop of wine on the tablecloth. "Clean that up," he commanded. Not to her, but to the air around her. As she dabbed at the stain, his associate nudged him. "Hey, Julian, isn't this the Sterling Tower? Didn't your dad get his start here?" Croft sneered. "My father was a glorified construction foreman on this project. He laid bricks. I own skylines. Big difference?" Clara bit the inside of her cheek, tasting blood. She retreated back to the hushed ballet of the service station, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. "Dignity, Clara Bell, is the one thing they can't take from you unless you give it away." It was precisely 9:15 p.m. when the private elevator, usually reserved for guests with reservations made a year in advance, chimed softly. The doors slid open, and the delicate equilibrium of the pinnacle shattered. An old man stepped out. He seemed to have wandered in from another century. He wore a heavy tweed jacket, the elbows patched with worn leather, and a pair of faded corduroy trousers. The jacket, though threadbare, was impeccably tailored, a ghost of its former Savile Row glory. He leaned on a simple, gnarled oak cane and walked with a pronounced, painful limp. His face was a road map of wrinkles, partially obscured by an untrimmed silver beard. But his eyes, they were an astonishingly sharp, intelligent blue, burning with a fire that defied his frail appearance. Mr. Davies's face went from its usual anxious pink to a blotchy, apoplectic red. He practically flew across the dining room, intercepting the man before he could take another step. Sir, I'm afraid you've made a mistake," Davies hissed, his body forming a physical barrier. "This is a private establishment. The public access ends on the observation deck. Perhaps you're lost." The old man said nothing. He didn't even look at Davies. His gaze swept over the room, filled with the city's power brokers, and landed on a small, unadorned table for two by the far window. Table 12. It was always kept empty, permanently reserved. A strange quirk of the restaurant's charter, Davies had once explained. The old man took a shuffling step around the sputtering manager. "Now see here!" Davies's voice rose, turning heads. "You are not welcome here. You're disturbing our guests. I'll have to ask you to leave before I call security." At the corner booth, Julian Croft's eyes lit up. He adored a public humiliation, as long as he wasn't the one being humiliated. "Let him be, Davies," Croft called out, a malicious grin spreading across his face. Maybe the old fella wants to see how the other half lives before he shuffles off this mortal coil. Give him a glass of water on my tab. His table howled with laughter. The insult hung in the air, thick and foul. Davies, emboldened by Croft's support, puffed out his chest. "Security!" he snapped into the tiny microphone on his lapel. "Code 3 in the main dining hall. We have a transient." The old man finally stopped. He turned his head slowly, his piercing blue eyes fixing first on Davies and then on Croft. He opened his mouth, a tremor running through his jaw. A low, guttural sound, a strangled rasp was all that came out. He tapped his throat with 2 fingers and gave a slight, frustrated shake of his head. "Well, what do you know?" Croft announced to the room. "He's broken, a mute bum. Davies, get this creature out of here. I'm trying to enjoy a $70 scallop, and I've lost my appetite." 2 hulking security guards in ill-fitting black suits emerged from a side hallway. They moved with the unthinking menace of men paid to be blunt instruments. They reached for the old man's arms. Clara watched from her station, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. But she wasn't just watching. She was seeing. She saw the way the man held his cane, not like a crutch, but like a scepter. She saw the fabric of his jacket. The tweed was worn, yes, but it was a Harris tweed, hand-woven and impossibly durable. She saw the signet ring on his pinky finger, nearly obscured by swollen knuckles, a simple, elegant crest she didn't recognize, but knew was old. And she saw his eyes. Those were not the vacant eyes of a lost soul. They were the eyes of a builder, a creator, a man who understood the very bones of the building they were standing in. Her grandmother's voice was in her ear again. Some people look, but they don't see. You've always been a seer, Clara Bell. Without a second thought, she placed her tray of water glasses down on the service counter with a sharp clang. The sound cut through the tension. "Stop!" she called out, her voice clearer and stronger than she expected. Every head in the room swiveled towards her. Davies looked as if she had just slapped him. "Mayhew, get back to your station this instant!" "He has a reservation," Clara announced, the lie forming on her lips with surprising ease. She walked forward, past the bewildered guards, and positioned herself between them and the old man. "What are you talking about?" Davies spluttered. "That's impossible." "Table 12, Clara said, her mind racing, pulling a detail from the deep well of her memory. "The reservation is under the name Warden. It's a standing reservation. I saw the note in the old logbooks." There was no such note, but she knew the table was called the Warden's Perch by the older kitchen staff. It was a gamble. Davies, a man who feared a procedural error more than a physical confrontation, faltered. "The Warden? I've never seen that." "It's a legacy booking," Clara pressed on, channeling the confidence she used to have defending her thesis papers. "From the original building charter. It predates the digital system." She turned to the old man, offering him a small, respectful smile and gesturing towards the empty table. "Your table is ready, sir." The old man looked at her, truly looked at her. For the first time. The fiery intelligence in his eyes softened with a flicker of something else. Surprise. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, and, with a dignity that defied his shabby clothes, walked past the stunned security guards and settled into the chair at the best table in the restaurant. The room was utterly silent. Julian Croft looked apoplectic. His floor show had been hijacked by a waitress. "Are you out of your mind?" Croft snarled, rising from his seat. "Davies, are you going to let this little girl in a cheap apron dictate your seating policy? That man smells of mothballs and failure. If he stays, I go. And when I go, so does Croft Holdings' six-figure corporate account." The threat was a guillotine hanging over Davies' head. It was also hanging over Clara's job, her grandmother's medicine, their very survival. The silence in the pinnacle was no longer elegant. It was suffocating. Davies' gaze darted between the furious CEO, the defiant waitress, and the silent old man, who now sat looking out at the city as if he were its rightful king. The calculation in Davies' mind was brutal and swift. Croft was profit. The old man was a problem. Clara was disposable. "Mayhew," Davies said, his voice a low, venomous whisper. "You have 5 seconds to escort that man out of here, or you can collect your final paycheck on the way." Clara looked at the old man. He had placed his hands on the table. They were gnarled with arthritis, but they were clean. They were the hands of a man who had once worked, had once built things. He looked profoundly alone. "I can't do that, Mr. Davies," Clara said softly. "Then you're fired," Davies shrieked, his composure finally snapping. "Security, get them both out." "Hold on," Julian Croft said, a slow, cruel smile returning to his face. He strolled over to table 12, a glass of champagne in his hand. He loomed over the seated old man. "I want to have a little fun first." He slammed his free hand down on the table. The water glass jumped. The old man didn't so much as blink. "Hey, Pops," Croft sneered. "Earth to Grandpa. Can you hear me? Or did you pawn your hearing aids for a bottle of cheap gin?" The old man slowly lifted his gaze to meet Croft's. His expression was a granite mask of indifference. "I bet he doesn't have 2 pennies to rub together," Croft laughed, turning to play to his audience. He reached into the pocket of his $1,000 trousers and pulled out a thick money clip. He peeled off a $1 bill. He crumpled it into a tight ball and flicked it at the old man's head. It bounced off his temple and landed on the pristine white tablecloth. "There," Croft said. "Go get yourself a cup of coffee. Now get the hell out of my sight." The old man stared at the crumpled dollar. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into the inside pocket of his tweed jacket. The room held its breath. Was he reaching for a weapon? He pulled out a pen. It was an old, magnificent fountain pen, its silver body tarnished with age, but its gold nib gleaming. He carefully uncrumpled the dollar bill, smoothed it out on the table, and wrote something on it. Then he pushed it back towards Croft. Croft snatched it up. He read the words written in a surprisingly elegant, if slightly shaky script. "Your charity is an insult," Croft read aloud, then threw his head back and roared with laughter. "The beggar has an ego. He finds my dollar insulting." He turned his venomous gaze on Clara. "You want to be his champion, sweetheart? Fine, take his order. But here's the deal. When he can't pay the bill, and we all know he can't, I'm not just having him arrested for theft. I'm having you arrested as his accomplice. Deal?" Davies nodded vigorously, his face slick with sweat. "That's more than fair, Mr. Croft. A very generous deal." Clara knew it was a cage. The cheapest appetizer on the menu was a $30 shrimp cocktail. But she had come too far to retreat. She looked at the old man, who was watching her with those piercing blue eyes. She nodded. "Deal." She walked to the table, her professionalism a shield against her fear. "Sir," she said gently, "may I take your order?" The old man looked at her, then at the leather-bound menu. He didn't open it. He tapped his chest, then made a gesture with his hand, a flat palm moving away from his mouth, as if pushing away words. He was trying to communicate his inability to speak. He reached for the pen and a clean linen napkin. In slow, deliberate strokes, he wrote a single word. "Ethelgard." Clara stared at the word. Croft was peering over her shoulder, his breath smelling of champagne and contempt. "Ethelgard, what the hell is that? Some kind of dementia-fueled gibberish." But Clara's mind was no longer in the restaurant. It was back in the dusty archives of the university library. Ethelgard. It wasn't a food. It wasn't gibberish. It was an old English word meaning noble protector or guardian of the estate. But it wasn't the word itself that struck her. It was the script. The letters were formed with a precision and style she hadn't seen outside of a textbook. It was a flawless example of insular majuscule, a script used in Irish and English monasteries in the 7th and 8th centuries. It was the script of the Book of Kells, of the Lindisfarne Gospels. It was a script that no one, absolutely no one, wrote with anymore. It was a secret language hidden in plain sight. The old man was watching her, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading hope. He tapped the napkin again. Clara took a steadying breath. This man wasn't just a vagrant. He was a scholar, or a historian, or something more. He was testing her. She ignored Croft's impatient scoffing. She picked up her own server's pen and, on the other side of the napkin, she wrote back. Her own calligraphy, honed by years of practice with her grandmother, was steady and clear. She didn't write in the ancient script. That would be too presumptuous. She wrote in a clean, modern cursive. "The warden's table is yours. What would the guardian of the estate care to eat?" The reaction was seismic. The old man's stone-faced mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. His jaw fell slack, and a ragged, wheezing breath escaped his lips. He stared at the napkin, then at her, as if she had just performed a miracle. He reached out and gripped her wrist, his hand surprisingly warm and strong. He nodded, once, twice, 3 times, his eyes suddenly shining with unshed tears. He then pointed to 2 items on the menu, the simplest things he could find: the pan-seared scallops and a glass of the house Chardonnay. Clara straightened up, a newfound power coursing through her veins. She turned to face Croft and Davies, her expression unreadable. "The gentleman will have the seared diver scallops," she announced, her voice ringing with authority. "And a glass of the Sonoma Cutra Chardonnay." Croft was momentarily stunned into silence by the bizarre, silent exchange. "What was that? What did you write to him?" "I was clarifying his dietary restrictions," Clara said coolly. "Something a good host should be concerned with. It requires a certain finesse." Croft's face flushed a dangerous shade of purple. "You little—" "I am taking his order," Clara cut him off, her voice like ice. "As per our deal." She turned on her heel and walked towards the kitchen, leaving Croft sputtering in her wake. But as she keyed in the order, a cold dread washed over her. The scallops and wine would come to nearly $100. She checked her own bank balance on her phone. She had 67.42 to her name. She prayed that the old man's tweed jacket had a pocket lined with gold, because if it didn't, she was going to jail, and her grandmother's oxygen machine would fall silent. Back in the dining room, Croft had recovered. He pulled out his phone. "Yes, connect me to the 18th precinct," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "I want to report a dine and dash in progress. I'd like a patrol car waiting at the front entrance in 20 minutes. We're about to have some fun." The old man watched him make the call. He didn't seem afraid. He took a sip of water and reached into his coat again. He pulled out a small, heavy object and placed it on the table. It was a simple, old-fashioned brass plumb bob, the kind a stonemason or an architect might use. He looked at Croft, then at the plumb bob, and for the first time all evening, a faint, cryptic smile touched the corners of his lips. The kitchen was a pressure cooker of controlled chaos, but Clara moved through it with a strange sense of calm. The head chef, a temperamental Frenchman named Antoine, glanced at the ticket. "Table 12? For the ghost? Davies will have your hide for this, Clara." "Just make it the best plate of scallops you've ever made, Antoine," she replied, her voice steady. "Please." Antoine saw the look in her eyes, not fear, but a fierce resolve. He grunted, "For you, Mayhew, I will make them sing." When she returned to the dining room, Julian Croft had become the ringmaster of a cruel circus. He'd had his chair turned to face table 12 directly, and he was providing a running commentary for his snickering acolytes. "Look at him, just sitting there," Croft narrated, swirling a glass of obscenely expensive cognac. "The king in his castle of delusions. Probably thinks he's some long-lost Rockefeller." The old man, however, seemed oblivious. He was gazing out the window at the city lights, his expression one of deep, melancholic contemplation. He held the brass plumb bob in his hand, its weight seeming to ground him. Clara served the wine with practiced grace, pouring a taste for him to approve. He simply nodded for her to proceed. As the pale gold liquid filled the glass, he looked up at her, his lips moving silently, forming a single word she could read easily. Why? The question was profound. Why was she risking her entire world for a silent stranger? Leaning in close, ostensibly to ask if the wine was to his liking, she whispered, "My grandmother taught me to read what is written, not what is spoken. Your eyes speak of honor." A flicker of intense emotion crossed the old man's face, a deep, ancient sorrow followed by a wave of overwhelming gratitude. He reached out and briefly touched the back of her hand with his cold fingers. "Thank you," his eyes said. "Enough with the secret conversations." Croft bellowed, his patience gone. "This is America. We speak English and we use money, not hand signals and riddles." He stood up, his face flushed with booze and impatience. "Davis, the police will be here any minute. Let's get this farce over with." Just then, the scallops arrived. Antoine had indeed made them sing. They were perfectly seared, nestled on a bed of saffron risotto, smelling of the sea and butter and herbs. The aroma momentarily silenced even Croft. Clara placed the plate before the old man. "Enjoy your meal, sir," she said softly. He picked up his fork and knife. The slight tremor in his hands was gone. They were now the steady, confident hands of a surgeon or an artist. He cut a single scallop, brought it to his lips and chewed it slowly, his eyes closed. And then a single tear traced a path down his wrinkled cheek. Then another. He wasn't sobbing, but a silent, steady stream of tears flowed as he ate, each bite a sacrament, each tear a memory. "Oh, for God's sake, now he's crying," Croft jeered, pulling out his phone to record a video. "This is priceless. The weeping hobo. I'm putting this on Instagram. Ooh, first decent meal. Maybe we can get a GoFundMe going for him." Clara felt a white-hot rage build in her chest. She gripped a nearby water pitcher, her knuckles turning white. She wanted nothing more than to march over and empty its contents over Croft's perfectly coiffed head. But she looked at the old man. He wasn't crying from gratitude for the food. She recognized the look from seeing old photographs with her grandmother. He was crying from memory. The taste of the scallops in this restaurant, in this building, meant something profound to him. He finished his meal, every last bite. He dabbed his mouth with the linen napkin, folding it precisely and placing it beside his plate. He looked at Clara and gave a single final nod. It was time. "Check, please," Croft sang out, rubbing his hands together in glee. "And have those officers come on up. The main event is about to begin." Davies printed the bill with trembling hands. He added several extra charges at Croft's direction: a security disturbance fee, a premium table surcharge, and a managerial consultation fee. He handed the leather folder to Clara. She opened it before presenting it, and her blood ran cold. The total was $1,175. "This is insane," she whispered to Davies, her voice shaking with fury. "His meal was $95. Mr. Croft was gracious enough to transfer his table's entire liquor tab to the gentleman's bill," Davies recited, avoiding her eyes, "as a lesson in financial responsibility. It's perfectly legal." "It's extortion," Clara hissed. "It's business," Croft said, appearing beside them. "And he's about to learn the price of wasting my time. Give him the bill, waitress." Her feet felt like they were encased in concrete as she walked to table 12. She placed the folder on the table. "I am so sorry," she mouthed, her voice failing her. "It's a trap." The old man gave her a look of reassurance. He opened the folder. He looked at the astronomical figure. He showed no surprise, no anger. He simply reached back into his tweed jacket. Croft and his cronies leaned forward, their faces alight with cruel anticipation. "Here it comes," Croft whispered loudly. "He's going to pull out a half-eaten sandwich and some pocket lint." The old man's hand emerged. It was empty. He patted his other pockets, a look of mild confusion on his face. Empty. He looked up at Clara and gave a small, helpless shrug. "He's tapped out," Croft roared, clapping his hands together. "I knew it. Davies, call in the cavalry." As if on cue, 2 uniformed Chicago police officers walked into the dining room. They looked bored and tired. "We got a call about a disturbance," the older officer said. "Theft of services," Croft announced, pointing dramatically at the old man. This man ordered a meal he had no intention of paying for. The bill is nearly $2,000. Arrest him. The officer sighed and approached the table. Sir, is this true? Can you pay this bill? The old man remained silent. He's a mute, officer, Davies supplied helpfully. And homeless. He's been harassing our patrons. Sir, the officer said, his voice hardening. I'm going to need you to stand up. You're coming with us. Wait! Clara stepped between the officer and the old man. Please, the bill is fraudulent. They padded it. He only had a small meal. Ma'am, step aside, or I'll have to arrest you for obstruction, the officer warned. The old man slowly pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. He was taller than he looked sitting down, and even with his stoop, he had an air of authority that made the officer pause. He reached into his pocket one last time. Watch it, he might have a shiv, one of Croft's juniors yelped. The old man pulled out the tarnished silver fountain pen. He took the fraudulent bill and turned it over. On the clean white back, he wrote a short sentence in his elegant, archaic script. He then handed the bill not to the police, not to Croft, but to Clara. Clara looked down at the writing. It wasn't a plea or a confession. It was an instruction. Tell them to call Walter Sterling. Tell him the warden has been detained at the Pinnacle. What does it say? Croft demanded. Is it his last will and testament? Clara's heart hammered. Walter Sterling. The name was vaguely familiar. A big downtown law firm. He wants to call his lawyer, she said to the officer. Croft laughed so hard he nearly choked. A lawyer? This bum has a lawyer. Who's he got on retainer? A public defender who lives in a van down by the river. The old man then pointed to the phone at the hostess stand. His eyes were no longer pleading. They were commanding. This is ridiculous, the officer said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. We're done here. No, Clara shouted. She ran to the hostess stand, grabbing the phone. What's the number? She asked the old man. He took the pen and a spare reservation card and wrote down a phone number with a downtown exchange. His hand was perfectly steady. You're fired, Mayhew! Fired! Davies was screaming. Clara ignored him, her fingers flying as she dialed the number. It rang once. Sterling, Price and Associates. How may I direct your call? A calm, professional voice answered. I need to speak to Walter Sterling, Clara said, her voice breathless. It's an emergency. Please just tell him. Tell him the warden has been detained at the Pinnacle. There was a pause on the other end. One moment, please. The line went silent. Time's up, the officer said, taking the old man's arm. Suddenly, the voice on the phone returned, sharp and alert. This is Walter Sterling. Who is this? Where is he? He's here, at the Pinnacle restaurant in the Sterling Tower. The police are about to arrest him. Keep them there, the lawyer commanded. His voice was like gravel and steel. Do not let them move him. I am 5 blocks away. I will be there in 3 minutes. The line went dead. It's his lawyer, Clara told the officers, trying to keep her voice from shaking. He's on his way. He said not to move him. A lawyer on the phone is not a lawyer in the room, the officer grunted, clicking one handcuff around the old man's wrist. The old man looked at his restrained hand, and then he looked at Julian Croft. The faint, cryptic smile returned to his lips, and this time it was utterly terrifying. The atmosphere in the Pinnacle had become a high-stakes theatrical performance, and everyone was frozen in their role. Julian Croft, the gloating villain, Mr. Davies, the snivelling henchman, the police officers, the instruments of a flawed justice, Clara, the terrified but defiant heroine, and the old man, the silent, enigmatic victim. The click of the second handcuff echoed in the silent room. Croft took another video with his phone, narrating in a triumphant whisper. And here we see the wheels of justice in motion. A lesson for all the freeloaders out there. The Pinnacle has a zero-tolerance policy for scum. Less than 3 minutes had passed when the private elevator chimed again. The doors slid open, not on a bewildered tourist or a wealthy diner, but on a man who moved with the force of a thunderclap. He was in his late 60s, with a mane of white hair, a face like a clenched fist, and eyes that could chip granite. He wore a rumpled but exquisitely tailored suit, and he was flanked by 2 younger, stone-faced associates. "Walter Sterling," Croft muttered, lowering his phone. "What the hell is he doing here?" Croft knew Sterling by reputation. He was the most feared litigator in Chicago, a legal shark who had represented the city's old money families for 50 years. Sterling's eyes scanned the room, bypassing the CEO and the manager as if they were furniture. His gaze landed on the handcuffed old man. The lawyer's ironclad composure shattered. His face went pale with shock, then flushed with a volcanic rage. "Arthur," he breathed, rushing forward. He stopped before the old man, his expression a mixture of horror and profound reverence. "My God, Arthur, what have they done to you?" He turned to the police officers, and his voice, when it came, was no longer a whisper. It was a roar that seemed to shake the very glass of the windows. "Get those filthy bracelets off him! Now!" The senior officer, startled by the man's sheer force of will, stammered, "Sir, this man is under arrest for theft of—" "This man," Sterling cut him off, his voice dripping with contempt, "could buy this city's entire police department and turn it into a parking garage if he felt so inclined. The man you have in handcuffs is Arthur Pendleton." A collective gasp went through the room. The name hung in the air, a relic from a bygone era. Arthur Pendleton. The reclusive, genius architect and developer who had built half of Chicago's iconic skyline in the 70s and 80s, including the very tower they were standing in. A man who had vanished from public life 30 years ago after a tragic accident, claimed his wife and son, rumored to be living out his days in silent grief on a remote estate. "That's impossible," Croft scoffed, though a tremor of fear had entered his voice. "Arthur Pendleton is a ghost. He's practically a myth. This is just some senile old man who looks like him." Sterling ignored him. He gently touched Mr. Pendleton's cuffed hands. "Arthur, are you all right? Can you speak?" Pendleton shook his head, tapping his throat. He then looked at Clara, a clear instruction in his eyes. Clara, finding her voice, stepped forward. "He has aphasia from a stroke years ago. He can understand everything. He just can't respond." Sterling's gaze fell on Clara for the first time. It was sharp and appraising. "And who are you, young lady?" "She's a fired waitress," Davies piped up, trying to regain control. Pendleton shook his head violently. He reached for the pen and napkin again, but his cuffed hands made it impossible. Sterling immediately understood. "Officer, I will say this one last time. Uncuff my client, or I will personally own your pension fund by dawn." The officer, looking from the furious lawyer to the silent, dignified old man, made a swift decision. He unlocked the handcuffs. Arthur Pendleton rubbed his wrists. He took the pen and wrote on a fresh napkin, handing it to Sterling. The lawyer read it, and his eyes widened. He looked up at Julian Croft, then at Mr. Davies. Finally, he looked at Clara. "What does it say?" Croft demanded, his bravado crumbling. "Does it say he's sorry for the disturbance?" Sterling smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. "No," he said softly. "It says, 'Begin the eviction proceedings. I want my building back.'" Croft paled. "Your building? This is my father's building. He built—" "Your father," Sterling interjected, his voice like ice. Was the project manager hired by Mr. Pendleton? The Sterling Tower, and yes, he named it after me, his oldest friend, has always been owned by the Pendleton Trust. Your company, Croft Holdings, merely holds the master lease for the commercial spaces. Sterling pulled a folded document from his breast pocket. A lease which, according to Clause 17, subsection B, can be terminated with immediate effect should any agent of the lessee bring disrepute upon the property or fail to uphold the standards of dignity and respect befitting the Pendleton name. I believe we have multiple witnesses to that breach of contract tonight. He turned to his associates. Get statements. Everyone. Croft stumbled backward. You can't. My lawyers will. Pendleton wrote another note and handed it to Sterling. The lawyer read it and nodded grimly. He looked at Croft. Mr. Pendleton has also just authorized me to place a call to the Securities and Exchange Commission. He has reason to believe that your recent acquisition of the Chicago Chronicle was funded through fraudulent means using over-leveraged assets. He wants a full audit of Croft Holdings. Immediately. The last vestiges of color drained from Croft's face. He knew what an audit like that would uncover. The shell corporations, the offshore accounts, the creative accounting that was the bedrock of his empire. He was ruined. He had been so busy playing God that he had never thought to check the name on the lease of his own Olympus. Pendleton then pointed a single, steady finger at Croft. His meaning was unmistakable. Officers, Sterling said calmly. The twin doors of the private elevator slid shut on Julian Croft's face, a mask of contorted disbelief, swallowing his final, impotent shriek. The soft chime that announced its descent was the only sound in the pinnacle. It was a sound that did not break the silence, but rather sealed it, encasing the entire dining room in a thick, crystalline amber of shock. The air, once crackling with tension and cruel anticipation, was now heavy, stagnant, as if the very molecules had been stunned into stillness. Every diner, every waiter, every busboy was a statue in a tableau of suspended reality. Clara felt as though she were at the bottom of a deep ocean, the pressure of 100 pairs of eyes pressing in on her. She could feel their gazes, curious, awed, fearful, crawling over her cheap, starched apron, her worn-out shoes. An hour ago, she had been invisible, a phantom refilling water glasses. Now, she was the epicenter of the earthquake that had just toppled a titan. Her own heartbeat was a frantic, muffled drum against the profound quiet. The spell was broken, not by a sound, but by a movement. Arthur Pendleton let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 3 decades. It was a ragged, shuddering exhalation that carried the weight of years spent in a self-imposed prison of silence and grief. His shoulders, held rigid with a defiance that belied his frail frame, slumped with an almost audible release. He slowly sat back down at table 12, his movements weary, ancient. The architect looked at the city sprawling beneath him, his city, and for the first time that night, his piercing blue eyes seemed to see it not as a monument to his past, but as a living, breathing entity he had long since abandoned. Walter Sterling, his rage having cooled to a glacial, methodical calm, turned his attention to the last remaining piece of the evening's ugliness. Mr. Davies was plastered against a mahogany wall panel, his face the color and texture of old parchment. He was trying to achieve a state of non-existence through sheer force of will. Mr. Pendleton. Mr. Sterling, sir, he stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. I assure you, a terrible, terrible misunderstanding. I was simply following protocol. Mr. Croft was a valuable client. I had a duty. Sterling took a single, deliberate step towards him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were scalpels. "A duty, Mr. Davies. Let's talk about duties. You have a duty to your staff, for instance. I've already had my associate place a call to a friend at the Department of Labor. They're quite interested in your creative interpretation of overtime laws, particularly concerning unpaid break periods. We'll be requesting payroll records going back 5 years. Davies began to sweat profusely, his plastered-down hair coming loose in damp strands. You also have a duty to your patrons, Sterling continued, his voice dropping to a confidential, venomous whisper. Which is why the health department will be conducting a full, unannounced, top-to-bottom inspection tomorrow morning. Let's say 8 a.m. sharp. I trust your walk-in refrigerators are up to code? No pesky violations hiding in the dark corners? Because my friend, the commissioner, is a stickler for details. Davies slid down the wall until he was in a near crouch, his face a rictus of pure terror. His kingdom, his meticulously managed stage of starched linen and feigned smiles, had been dismantled in less than 10 minutes. Arthur Pendleton paid the man no mind. His world had contracted to the small universe of Table 12, and to the young woman standing beside it, trembling slightly. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the weight of the moment settled between them. The architect, the builder of skylines, and the waitress, the decipherer of forgotten words. He picked up his magnificent silver fountain pen, the nib still faintly stained with the ink of his quiet rebellion. He took a clean linen napkin, the very medium of their first secret communication, and began to write. His hand moved with a fluid grace that had been absent earlier, no longer constricted by the need to defend, but freed by the desire to build something new. He slid the napkin across the table to Clara. Her first instinct was to refuse, to shake her head and say she wanted nothing. This was too big, too surreal. She was Clara Mayhew. She cleaned up spilled wine and worried about pharmacy co-pays. She did not belong in this story. But Arthur's eyes held her, gentle yet insistent. With fingers that felt disconnected from her body, she picked up the napkin. The script was the same elegant, insular majuscule, a language of saints and scholars, but the message was profoundly modern. A structure is only as strong as its foundation. For 30 years my foundation has been dust. I wish to rebuild it. I require a chief curator for the Pendleton Library and Historical Foundation. Clara read the words once, then twice. They refused to assemble into a coherent meaning. Chief curator? Foundation? It was like reading a language she almost knew. A dream she'd once had, whispered in a vocabulary she no longer used. Her mind flashed to the university, to the scent of ancient vellum, the thrill of tracing a history through a single pen stroke. A door she had long since bricked up in her mind began to tremble on its hinges. "Sir," she whispered, her voice hoarse, I'm a waitress. I have a high school diploma and 3 years of an unfinished history degree." Arthur simply tapped the napkin, then began to write on a new one, his pen scratching softly in the cavernous silence. "You have a doctorate in humanity. You have a master's degree in courage. These are not qualifications one acquires in a university. They are forged. As for the rest—" He paused, then wrote a single figure at the bottom of the napkin. A salary. Clara's eyes scanned the number, and the air left her lungs in a rush. It wasn't just a salary, it was a rescue line. It was a new life. It was the end of the constant, gnawing fear that had been her companion for 4 years. It was the weight of 1,000 oxygen tanks lifting from her shoulders. And still, she hesitated. The chasm between her reality and this offer was too vast to cross. "Why?" she managed to ask, the word barely audible. Why me? He looked at her, and his expression was one of profound, weary understanding. He wrote one final message, the most important one. Because when everyone in this room looked at me, they saw a broken old man, a liability, a piece of refuse. You looked at me, and you saw a manuscript worth reading. You defended the story, not the vessel. That is the only qualification that matters. He then reached into his wallet, bypassing the credit cards, and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, a prescription receipt she had accidentally dropped during an earlier shift. He tapped a name on it, a complex medication for pulmonary fibrosis. He then looked at her, his eyes full of a quiet, shared knowledge. He had not just been sitting there, he had been seeing. He had been listening to her hushed, frantic phone calls with the insurance company from the service station. He had seen the desperation she hid behind a professional smile. On the napkin, he added a postscript. The Foundation provides comprehensive medical insurance for all staff and their designated family, effective immediately. I know a specialist at Northwestern, the best in the world. That was it. That was the keystone that locked the entire impossible structure into place. It wasn't the money, not even the dream job. It was the mention of her grandmother, the quiet acknowledgement of the true, hidden burden she carried. The dam of her composure, which had withstood insults, threats, and firings, finally broke. A single hot tear fell onto her cheek, then another. They were not tears of sadness, but of a relief so profound it was physically painful. I don't have the right clothes for a job like that, she choked out, a laugh catching in her throat, along with a sob. For the first time that evening, a smile spread across Arthur Pendleton's face. It was a slow, seismic event, a tectonic shift that pushed aside decades of sorrow, revealing a landscape of warmth and humor beneath. The smile reached his eyes, and they blazed with a light she hadn't seen before. He took the pen one last time and scribbled 2 words on the corner of the menu. "We'll shop." Then he pointed to the dessert section. Clara followed his finger. Chocolate lava cake. A simple, decadent, life-affirming thing. She laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed in the silent, reverent room. Wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, she stood up straight, her posture transformed. She was no longer Clara Mayhew, the harried waitress. She was Clara Mayhew, the chief curator. "Right away, Mr. Pendleton," she said, her voice clear and bright. "Coming right up." As she turned towards the kitchen, a single startling sound broke the quiet, the sharp crack of 2 hands coming together. An elderly woman in a Chanel suit and pearls was clapping. Her husband joined in. Then, a banker at a nearby table. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet, the applause swelling into a thunderous, rolling ovation. They were not clapping for the reclusive billionaire or the powerful lawyer. They were clapping for the girl in the apron, the one who had reminded a room full of kings that true power was not the ability to command, but the courage to care. 1 week later, Clara stood in a place that smelled of time itself. The Pendleton Library was not a room. It was a cathedral, occupying the entire 96th and 97th floors of the tower, connected by a spiral staircase of wrought iron and dark, polished oak. Sunlight streamed through 2-story windows, illuminating rivers of dust motes dancing in the air. The walls were lined, floor to ceiling, with books. Not just books, but histories, philosophies, poems, the collected consciousness of centuries, bound in leather and linen. She wore a simple grey wool dress, a purchase from the most surreal shopping trip of her life, with a silent, smiling Arthur and a bemused Walter Sterling. The dress felt like a costume. She felt like an imposter, a child playing dress-up in a giant study. She ran her hand over the spine of a 16th-century Mercator atlas, her fingers tracing the faded gold leaf. She was terrified she might break it. She was terrified she might break everything. The soft tap of an oak cane on the hardwood floor announced his arrival. Arthur walked in, no longer the stooped, frail figure from the restaurant, but a man slowly re-inhabiting his own skin. He had forgone the tweed for a simple cashmere sweater, and his beard was neatly trimmed. "It is overwhelming," a voice said. Clara started. The voice was low, gravelly, and hesitant, like an old engine turning over for the first time in years. It was Arthur. "You can speak," she whispered, stunned. "A little," he rasped, touching his throat. "The doctors call it selective mutism, a psychological cage built around a physical injury. After the accident, the words stopped. There was nothing left to say. It seems I have found something." He gestured around the library. "This has all been my cage. A beautiful one, but a prison nonetheless." He walked to the window, standing beside her, looking down at the city. "My wife, Eleanor, she was a historian, a paleographer like you. This was meant to be her library. We designed it together. After she and our son were killed, I locked the doors. I couldn't bear the silence in here. It was louder than the city." He turned to her, his blue eyes searching her face. "For 30 years, I have been a ghost in my own life, haunting the blueprints of what should have been. That night, in the restaurant, I went there for a reason. It was the anniversary of their death. I went to that table, our table, to say a final goodbye, to let the ghost fade completely." He paused, the effort of speaking still new to him. "And then I saw you. You looked past the ghost and saw the man. And you spoke a language I thought only Eleanor and I understood. The language of the script. You didn't just give me a table, Clara. You gave me a voice. You reminded me that the story wasn't over." A phone buzzed in Clara's pocket. She excused herself, her heart leaping. It was her grandmother. "Clarabelle." Her grandmother's voice was stronger than it had been in years, the wheezing rasp almost gone. "The doctor Mr. Sterling sent. Oh, Clara, he talks about new treatments, trials. He gave me so much hope." "That's wonderful, Nana," Clara said, her own voice thick with emotion as she looked at Arthur, who was watching her with a gentle, knowing expression. "But what about you, dear?" her grandmother asked. "This new job, a curator? It sounds too good to be true." Clara looked around the sun-drenched library, at the silent, waiting stories on every shelf. She looked at the old architect, the man who had built the city's body, and who had now entrusted her with its soul. "No, Nana," she said, a smile spreading across her face. "It's not too good to be true. It's just true." 6 months later, the Pendleton Library was no longer silent. It was filled with the soft murmur of conversation and the rustle of turning pages. Clara, standing at a podium at the center of the great room, looked out at a crowd of journalists, academics, and a dozen bright-eyed, nervous university students. "The Clara Mayhew Grant for Historical Studies," she announced, her voice steady and confident, "will provide a full 4-year scholarship and living stipend to one promising low-income history student at the University of Chicago each year. It is the founding mission of the Pendleton Foundation to ensure that the stories of our past are accessible to everyone, not just those who can afford the price of admission." From the front row, Arthur Pendleton watched her, his hands resting on his oak cane. He rarely spoke in public, preferring to let Clara be his voice. He had become the architect again, and she, his design brought to life. He had given her a foundation, and she, in turn, was building its legacy. Later, after the press had gone, and the students were excitedly touring the archives, Arthur joined her by the great window. The sun was setting, painting the Chicago skyline in hues of gold and rose. "Walter told me I was a sentimental old fool," Arthur said, his voice now a comfortable, familiar rumble. "Hiring a waitress with no financial experience to run a multi-million-dollar foundation." "And what did you tell him?" Clara asked, the familiar cadence of their conversation a comfort to them both. "I told him that finance is the science of assets. It's easy. You are an expert in the science of value, which is infinitely more complex," Arthur said. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You didn't save me from Julian Croft that night, Clara. You saved me from the ghost of Arthur Pendleton. You showed me there was still honor in the world, that a story could have a new chapter, even after you thought the book was closed." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a long, slender box made of polished cherry wood. "I had this made for you." Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a fountain pen. Its body was crafted from a piece of reclaimed oak from the original 1970s construction scaffolding of the tower itself. Its nib was gleaming gold, and its silver clip was engraved with a tiny, perfect representation of the insular majuscule C. It was not a gift, it was an investiture, the most powerful tool there is, Arthur said softly, echoing her thoughts from that first day. It builds worlds, it records truths, it connects the past to the future. He closed her hand around the pen's warm, wooden body. "I am the architect of the vessel, Clara, but you are the author of its purpose. This foundation, this library, this legacy, it is your story to write now." Clara looked down at the pen in her hand, its weight feeling both profound and perfectly natural. She looked out at the sprawling city, a vast, illuminated manuscript of steel and light. She thought of the girl who had once wiped its tables, who had traded her dreams for her grandmother's next breath, never knowing that in deciphering the scripts of the dead, she was learning the language of her own life. She was not that girl anymore. She was the guardian of the estate, the curator of the story. "Well then," she said, turning to Arthur with a smile that mirrored his own, "let's go give them a hell of a second act." Together, the architect and the curator, the builder and the scholar, stood before the city they both loved. One had given it its bones, the other was now giving it its voice, ready to build a new chapter, one written not in concrete and glass, but in the enduring, unbreakable ink of human dignity.